I am Lenora Whitaker, 65, and I have always taken pride in my independence, my work, and the life I've quietly built in Seattle. Tonight, though, none of that mattered. The grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. The faint hum of classical music drifting through clusters of impeccably dressed guests. I stood near the entrance, adjusting the shawl around my shoulders, feeling out of place among the designers, bankers, and socialites who had gathered to celebrate my son Austin's engagement. Then he spoke. "You're an embarrassment. You're not welcome here," Austin said, his words slicing through the chatter like glass. Heads turned, conversations froze. My own pulse thundered in my ears. I smiled. Not the flustered, apologetic smile of a mother caught off guard, but the measured, quiet smile of someone who had learned early in life to endure slights without giving them the satisfaction of breaking me. I nodded. A small, controlled gesture, as if confirming I'd heard him, and let him continue. Around us, whispers started. Eyes flicked between mother and son, and I could feel the weight of judgment settle like a heavy coat over my shoulders. I thought of the years I had spent raising Austin alone, teaching him to ride a bike, helping with homework, holding him when life was unkind. None of it mattered to him now. Not my hands that had worked tirelessly, not the love I had poured into him. I let the moment hang, tasting both betrayal and the bitter irony that he was choosing social image over family. I straightened my back, adjusted my shawl again, and stepped aside as the crowd's attention shifted. There would be time to act later. But for now, I needed to watch. I stepped out onto the terrace, letting the cool Seattle air wash over me. The city glittered below, a patchwork of lights reflecting off the sound. And for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. No one here knew the truth about me, not the socialites circling my son like hawks, not Austin, and certainly not the friends who assumed my modest home meant a modest life. For decades, I had quietly built a small real estate empire, buying undervalued properties, renovating them, and turning them into thriving rentals. My investments had grown steadily, compounding beyond anything Austin could imagine. But I kept it hidden, deliberately. I wanted him to grow up understanding work, responsibility, and the value of effort, not money. I wanted him to find his own footing in the world without the weight of inherited wealth shaping his every decision. My Seattle home, tucked into a quiet neighborhood of cedar trees and brick sidewalks, was modest yet comfortable. A warm living room, shelves heavy with books, the kitchen stocked with essentials rather than luxury brands. It was a sanctuary of normalcy, a place where he had learned to laugh, argue, and dream without the pressure of opulence. I looked back at the ballroom through the glass doors, remembering Austin's words. He had no idea who I truly was. No idea that the modest facade he had always sneered at concealed a life of foresight, resilience, and quiet triumph. I felt a twinge of both pride and melancholy, knowing the timing was near for the truth to surface. The years of patience, of planning, of observing and letting him stumble through his assumptions, all of it had led to this point. I straightened my coat and turned back to the city skyline, letting the faint glow of the lights remind me wealth and power can be invisible, but integrity and timing reveal themselves in the moments that matter most. I remembered the first time it had truly stung Austin's wedding 3 years ago. The family table was set, polished silverware and crystal glasses glinting under the warm chandelier light. I thought I'd be seated beside him, proud as any mother on her son's wedding day. Instead, a young cousin tapped me on the shoulder. "The staff section is over there," she said with a nervous glance at the newlyweds. "Dad," "You'll be more comfortable with people who understand your situation," Austin had whispered, eyes darting away from mine. The words had sliced through me like ice, casual and rehearsed, as though my decades of work, my guidance, my presence in his life were nothing more than a costume I had worn poorly. I forced a smile, my fingers brushing the rim of a glass I didn't drink from, and nodded as if I agreed. Over the years, the pattern had only grown more pronounced. At holiday gatherings, he would apologize for my hands roughened by work, as if the calluses and stains of honest labor were shameful. At his graduation party, he introduced me as someone from outside the family business, glossing over the years I had poured into teaching him responsibility, empathy, and resilience. Every subtle critique, every sideways glance, accumulated quietly, leaving bruises invisible to everyone else. I thought of the mornings after his mother passed, when I had carried Austin on my hip, soothed him through tears, and guided him through a childhood abruptly halved by loss. I had taught him to ride a bike, to balance homework with chores, to understand that kindness mattered more than appearances. I had tried to instill pride in effort and humility in success. Yet, here he was, entitlement shining in his eyes, the lessons of his youth buried beneath his desire for status. I could see now that my patience had been both a gift and a test, one he had begun to fail. The ballroom lights, the polished laughter, the whispered admiration of the crowd, it all felt hollow. A stage for Austin's pride, rather than the homegrown warmth we had shared. I exhaled slowly, feeling both sorrow and determination. The history of disregard had created the tension that now demanded resolution. I would wait, observe, and act, but this pattern could not continue unchecked. The inheritance had always come with strings attached. $33 million in total, $28 million locked in a trust. $5 million in immediate cash meant more than wealth. It carried responsibility. Each clause had been carefully drafted by Margaret Davis, my late husband's trusted attorney, and the terms were clear annual donations to charity, respectful treatment of surviving family members, and yearly reports proving compliance. Austin had signed the documents without hesitation, nodding at the lawyer's explanation as if the words were formalities. Inconsequential steps on the path to luxury. I had watched him become intoxicated with the idea of affluence, the penthouse, the designer wardrobe, the country club memberships, the substance of the inheritance, the moral and relational responsibilities, had slipped past him entirely. He focused on image, on the approval of strangers who admired wealth but not character. I remembered the lunch at the Seattle Country Club 2 weeks ago, the one where he handed me the business card of an image consultant and suggested I learn how to dress appropriately so I wouldn't embarrass him among his peers. He had no idea that the rules of the inheritance were not merely guidelines, but conditions with teeth, clauses that could revoke everything he had been so eager to flaunt. I studied the ballroom from the terrace, letting the city lights reflect off the water below as I reflected on his choices. He focused on the money, ignoring the rules that could cost him everything. Pride and ambition had clouded his judgment, making him blind to the history, the effort, and the family loyalty that had built both our lives. The realization settled over me. Austin's obsession with status had created the perfect conditions for his own undoing. His disregard for the inheritance's requirements was not a mistake, it was a pattern. And patterns, once established, could have consequences far beyond what he imagined. Back in the quiet of my home, I spread the evidence across the mahogany table, each piece a testament to Austin's disregard. Texts where he dismissed my efforts, photos from holiday dinners showing him introducing me as help, and voice recordings from the country club lunch, all carefully archived, dated, and cross-referenced. Every moment of public humiliation, every sideways glance, every whispered slight had been captured over the years. I had always been patient, allowing him to stumble, to learn, to mature, but patience had its limits. The inheritance was more than money. It was a measure of character, of respect, of understanding the value of family. Austin had ignored those responsibilities, and it was time the consequences were made clear. I reached for the phone and dialed Margaret Davis, the family attorney who had guided us through the nuances of the inheritance. Her calm voice on the line contrasted sharply with the storm brewing in my chest. "Margaret, it's time to let the documents speak for themselves," I said, steady and measured. She responded with the quiet efficiency I had come to expect, arranging a meeting, reviewing the compiled evidence, confirming that the language in the will allowed for immediate enforcement if the conditions were violated. I paused, glancing at the framed photographs lining the walls, memories of Austin as a boy, learning to ride his bike, laughing after his mother's gentle scolds. Protecting him from embarrassment had always been my instinct, but now it was the opposite he needed to understand, that actions have consequences. Sorting the files. I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't realized I could carry in such a moment. Each piece of evidence was not just proof of disrespect. It was a roadmap for accountability, a tool to restore balance without lowering myself to anger or confrontation. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. The stage was set, the pieces aligned. Austin had chosen to ignore the responsibilities that came with his inheritance, and the moment for reckoning was approaching. The documents, the evidence, and Margaret's guidance would ensure that respect and integrity, long overlooked, would finally take center stage. The ballroom was alive with laughter and the clinking of glasses. But the moment Austin stepped toward me, the energy shifted. He stopped in front of me, his designer jacket immaculate, his smile polished, and then spoke in a tone I recognized all too well. Condescending. Rehearsed. "Mom, you need help fitting in with people like us," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd as though seeking their silent approval. The words landed like stones, each one striking deeper than the last. Around us, conversations stuttered, glasses paused midair, and the laughter faded to whispers. I could feel every eye on us, some sympathetic, some curious, and some judging. I let a calm smile spread across my face, though my chest tightened with the sting of betrayal. My hands, steady and unshaking, rested lightly on the table behind me. I had faced humiliation before, but this was different. This was public, deliberate, calculated to show me as a relic of a life he now considered embarrassing. Austin didn't wait for a response. He turned, subtly signaling the staff, and began to mingle. Leaving me to absorb the weight of the room's shifting energy, I straightened my posture, letting my composure speak louder than any words could. My mind cataloged every insult, every slight, every carefully ignored responsibility he had accrued over the years. This was not a simple quarrel. It was the culmination of a pattern of disrespect, now staged before 100 or more witnesses. Yet beneath the calm, my pride burned. I refused to be diminished for the sake of his social ambitions. Every measured breath I took reminded me that patience, foresight, and quiet strategy had brought me to this moment. I would respond, but not in haste, not in anger. Every action needed precision, like placing the final pieces on a chessboard. The crowd murmured, sensing tension, as Austin laughed lightly at something someone whispered in his ear. I turned my gaze to the glittering chandeliers, letting their reflection in the polished floor remind me tonight. Respect would either be reclaimed or irreversibly lost. The hum of polite conversation in the ballroom was interrupted when Margaret Davis, poised and composed, stepped forward beside me. She opened her leather briefcase with a quiet authority that commanded attention. The chatter dulled instantly, the guests sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. I straightened my back, meeting Austin's gaze, calm but resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice steady, "Lenora Whitaker isn't just your mother. She built a $2 billion real estate empire over the past 30 years. She has created and managed properties across Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, sustaining a legacy that spans generations." The room froze. Gasps punctuated the air. Glasses rattled lightly as murmurs swept through the crowd. Austin's face drained of color, his carefully maintained composure cracking under the collective shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time that evening, he seemed uncertain, vulnerable, exposed. Margaret continued, her tone unyielding. "Furthermore, the inheritance Austin received comes with enforceable conditions, as outlined in the trust documents. His repeated violations, public disrespect, and disregard for family responsibilities have triggered a review of his entitlement." I watched the socialites' faces shift from admiration of wealth to astonishment, some exchanging whispered speculations. The guests who had once nodded politely at Austin's self-assuredness now regarded him with doubt and unease. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Austin's eyes darted around, seeing not just the guests, but the consequences of his choices reflected in their faces. His luxury penthouse, the memberships, the expensive wardrobe, all potentially at risk. He had spent months curating his image, yet it was crumbling in a matter of minutes. I felt a subtle thrill of vindication, tempered by the responsibility that had brought me here. This revelation was not revenge. It was truth made visible, a recalibration of respect and accountability. Every calculated decision, every patient year of observation had led to this moment. Austin now understood wealth without character, social climbing without integrity, left one exposed, no matter how carefully the illusion was constructed. The room held its breath, and I stepped slightly forward, letting the weight of my presence punctuate the announcement. The billionaire reality of my life and the enforcement of the rules Austin had ignored was no longer hidden. The stage was set, and the consequences would unfold. The following morning, Margaret Davis called with the formal notice Austin's inheritance was frozen pending full review. The penthouse deed, the luxury cars, the country club memberships all held in limbo. I listened quietly, letting the reality settle. The documents were thorough, final, and irrefutable. For the first time, Austin would face the consequences of ignoring both the rules and the family he had once taken for granted. I walked through my home later that day, letting the familiar creak of the hardwood floors ground me. I could have claimed the funds, used my position to punish him, or flaunt my power for my own satisfaction. Instead, I made my choice. "I'm not taking his inheritance," I said to Margaret, my voice calm. "It will go where it does the most good." I imagined scholarships for underprivileged youth, community programs, the quiet work of building lives without fanfare or recognition. Across Seattle, the repercussions rippled quickly. The penthouse went into foreclosure proceedings, and the luxury cars were repossessed. Memberships were terminated. Friends and acquaintances whispered among themselves about the sudden reversal of fortune. Austin, who had once curated every detail of his social image, now confronted the stark reality of what ignoring moral obligations could cost. I observed the unfolding events without malice, satisfied that principle had guided the outcome. There was no gloating in my demeanor. Only the quiet authority of someone who had built success on integrity and patience. The lesson, I hoped, would resonate far deeper than any financial loss. Respect is earned. Obligations are binding, and shortcuts through pride and entitlement lead only to consequences. Standing on my terrace that evening, the sound of the water and the city below grounding me, I felt a moral weight lift. Justice had not been about vengeance. It had been about alignment between action and principle. I had upheld what mattered, and in doing so, reminded both Austin and the world that integrity is never invisible. It shapes every choice, every outcome, and every life it touches. A week after the inheritance was frozen, Austin showed up at my front porch, hesitant, fidgeting with the cuffs of his shirt. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence that had once made his entitlement seem untouchable. I motioned for him to sit on the worn wooden bench beside me, the one where we had shared quiet mornings and late-night talks when he was a boy. "I'm sorry for everything," he said, his voice low, trembling just enough to reveal sincerity. "I want to learn how to respect you." I studied him, noticing the vulnerability that had been buried beneath years of pride and social ambition. The apology was awkward, tentative, but it was a start. I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us, filled not with anger, but with the weight of unspoken history. Over the following weeks, Austin began small, deliberate steps to rebuild himself. He took a position as an administrative assistant at a nonprofit, working entry-level hours, managing errands and data with the humility he had never experienced before. On weekends, he volunteered at youth programs, mentoring teenagers who had fewer opportunities than he had ever imagined. Each action was a lesson, a chance to understand responsibility beyond money or image. I watched from a distance, reflecting on forgiveness, the boundaries I needed to maintain, and the trust that had been fractured over decades. Rebuilding was neither immediate nor effortless. It required consistency, accountability, and willingness to be seen without the protective armor of arrogance. One evening, as we shared coffee on the porch, he looked at me with a hesitant smile. "I know I have a lot to prove," he said. I offered a small nod in return. Not absolution, but acknowledgement that progress was possible. Tentatively, quietly, the first threads of connection began to weave themselves back together, fragile yet real, hinting at the possibility of a relationship rebuilt on respect rather than entitlement. The months that followed were quiet but transformative. Austin had settled into a rhythm of accountability, embracing work that challenged him to think beyond appearances and status. I watched him navigate the nonprofit office, his sleeves rolled up, lending a hand wherever needed, and I felt a mixture of pride and relief. The boy who had once sought approval through wealth and image was beginning to understand responsibility, humility, and the weight of respect earned. One afternoon, we walked along the waterfront, the sound of water lapping against the docks mingling with the distant hum of the city. I glanced at him, noticing the thoughtful way he carried himself, the attentiveness in his eyes when he spoke with volunteers or listened to stories from the kids he mentored. It was a quiet revelation. Character was not measured by inheritance, connections, or the size of a penthouse. It was evident in choices, in the small actions that reflected integrity. "What matters isn't money," I said, stopping to look out over the sound. "It's who we choose to be and how we treat others." Austin nodded slowly, the lesson sinking in deeper than any lecture, any rebuke, or any financial consequence ever could. He had begun to internalize that true worth lay not in what was inherited, but in what was cultivated through effort, humility, and respect for the people who had shaped him. I stayed a moment longer, watching him help a young volunteer with a project, his hands steady, his demeanor patient. These first steps into independence and empathy were small but meaningful, a sign that the lessons of the past months were taking root. The tension of pride, entitlement, and misjudgment had eased, replaced by a tentative but genuine connection between mother and son. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft golds and pinks, I realized that what had begun as a confrontation over money had become a journey toward understanding, respect, and mutual growth. We had both learned that true legacy is measured not by wealth, but by the character we leave behind and the respect we earn along the way.